Hello and welcome to an Infinity the Game N4 faction focus for the Jurisdictional Command of Tunguska. I have been asked, hey, with N5 coming, am I going to continue to do faction focuses? And the answer, evidently, is yes. I enjoy making these videos. Now, that said, obviously this is going to be obsolete in a couple of months, so we're going to be a little light and a little bit less reverent for the few of these that we do between now and the release of N5, but I am going to keep doing them. And one of the ones that I wanted to do, because I've been playing it recently, is Tunguska. So, as usual in this video, we're going to be going through the jurisdictional command of Tunguska, talking about them, who they are, what their faction identity is, and maybe looking forward to N5 perhaps just a little bit before jumping into Infinity Army and going through a bunch of the profiles that for me exemplify the faction. We won't cover everything, but we will cover most of the profiles that I at least play, and as always, you're welcome to jump into the comments and tell me what I've missed and why it's awesome. So, who are the jurisdictional command of Tunguska and where do they fit into the broader nomad ecosystem? So historically, since their release, Tunguska have occupied the niche of kind of the elite sectoral, with kind of heavy use of air quotes there. And elite in this instance historically sort of meant expensive. Now, by comparison, Corregidor were, emphasis on were, the Lynx faction. That's kind of changed with the Link Team update, which has diluted their identity a little bit, but Corregidor were the Link Team faction, Bakunin were the cheap and cheerful faction with things like 9-point moderators and 6-point Morlocks, and that left Tunguska as the expensive faction. And that was not really a fantastic place to be. In Infinity, no matter what kind of army it is you're playing, you benefit from a baseline of relatively cheap and affordable pieces. There's only so much space in any given list for expensive, high powerful stuff. In general, yes, it's fine on an individual profile to pay more points for more stats, more points for more capability, but when an entire army pays more points for more stuff, you begin to hollow out what it is you're actually trying to do very quickly. It's hard to hit a good model count, it's hard to hit a good order count, and you actually end up diluting your power because you are spending all of these points on your cheaper models that aren't necessarily going to contribute hugely to the game, which leaves you proportionally fewer points for the actually expensive elite things in a list. So in a kind of ironic way, if you took a faction like Bakunin, for example, it could actually better play an elite style because it could support that elite style with cheap things. It could take those 6-point Morlocks and 9-point moderators, which allowed it more points for things like its Riot Girls. And so Bakunin, just because even before the rework it was better rounded than Tunguska, could play elite kind of better than Tunguska could. That, however, has changed, and it's changed with the release of a number of models, but in particular the Outrage packs and the Reinforcement packs, which have introduced, many factions have benefited from those models being introduced, but they have helped refine Tunguska's identity. Tunguska now is still the elite faction, but elite in this instance means specialized. Pound for pound, many Tunguska models might be perhaps slightly more expensive than some of their contemporaries, but the really good and interesting profiles in Tunguska have something that specializes them really clearly in one direction, and they're only really paying points for that. So when we have a look at things like Interventors and Rounders, and to an extent even the Kulak payback unit and Grenzers, and then Hollowmen, etc. as well, there might be other cheaper equivalents in other factions, but you're paying for specialization on those pieces in one specific direction. Interventors are very, very good at hacking. Rounders are very, very good at face-to-face rolls. They don't necessarily have much armor, they aren't resilient, they're a single wound troop, but they're good at that one specific thing. And that's a way that lets you actually play elite armies in Infinity in a way that works in the context of the broader game system, because you're paying for specialization, not just more general stats. That works really well and really interestingly and lets you build Tunguska lists where any individual piece is leaning heavily on a specific role, but is really good at that role. And that allows for a specific style, it allows you to play towards certain angles. You use your elite gunfighters for gunfighting, you use your elite hackers for hacking, you use your relatively elite warbands for doing warband things. You get to play the entire scope of the Infinity game, and where you will fall down is if you're in a situation where you have to use your single wound light infantry gunfighter to fight a chain rifle or dodge a mine, but where you will succeed is when you get to use your single wound elite light infantry gunfighter to take a face-to-face roll where it's just the numbers on that roll that you're interested in. And so that gives us basically a very cool dynamic for Tunguska that sets it apart from broader nomads and from its sister sectorals. Now, aesthetically, Tunguska also deserves a standout, to me having one of the coolest aesthetics in Nomads and Infinity, which is a real heavy, like, organized crime kind of vibe. And that splits the sectoral into basically two kind of aesthetic looks, particularly now that Zellenkriegers exist, which is that you have your Securitate style, like, consummate professionals in the way that only things like money launderers and casino security can be professional. You have shades and ties. And although I'm not incredibly hot on Securitate as a profile, they're useful and necessary, I just don't love them, the look is incredible. And it contrasts very nicely, that really professional vibe contrasts very nicely with the other side of organized crime, which is the hired goons. And there are now at least some very good, very nice, like hired goon kind of vibes in the form of Zellenkriegers and Extreme Zellenkriegers, etc., which have done a huge amount to round out Tunguska and fill it out as a sectoral, both mechanically and aesthetically. And so it's for that reason that Tunguska have actually ended up, right now at least, being probably my favorite kind of nomads to play. Previously that would have been vanilla, I'm a big vanilla player, but with Tunguska I'm getting enough of what I want from a vanilla faction, which is to say well-rounded experience, with that kind of focused playstyle and of course access to link teams that a sectoral brings. Now, in terms of strengths versus limitations, obviously we've just discussed all of Tunguska's strengths. We do really have to mention their limitations, which are what you would expect now that they have settled into that niche of a specialized army, which is that you have exploitable weaknesses built into your link teams and your troops. If you are running armies like I do in Tunguska, which focus a little bit more on the single wound troops and don't use the robust multiple wound heavy infantry as much, you're going to be susceptible to and need to defend against warband attacks. And like basically any nomad force, Tunguska are in a position where they don't like losing info war dominance. Now, the good news there is that I would say probably of any nomad army, Tunguska are one of the best at not getting got in the hacking game. Whereas a regular, like a vanilla nomads army, or certainly Bakunin and often Corregidor as well, can be susceptible to attack by like real alpha hackers. So when you have something like operations subsection of Aleph, or the combined army, where they have reasonably good access to pitches that can move forward and lay down pitches on your hackers if they go first, and then spool up just some incredibly high quality hacking in the form of either the Asura in OSS or things like the Anathematic in Combined Army, and just absolutely blow your hacking game out of the water, turn your entire guided missile package off by just killing all of your spotlight capable things. That is an attack pattern that regular nomads really struggle against. Tunguska doesn't like it, it's still a vulnerability that they have, but they're probably the best nomad faction for weathering that storm, just because Interventors have BTS out the absolute ass. BTS 9 on your hackers means that Trinities coming in, even burst 4 Trinities from the Anathematic and high damage Trinities from pieces like the Asura, you have a reasonable chance of surviving that kind of attack with some of your hacking network intact. And that's kind of the payoff of Tunguska's specialized vibe. And then finally, in terms of other notable weaknesses, just the nature of being a somewhat specialized army means that you tend to have troopers that are good at specific things, which means that if those troopers are removed, you can be vulnerable to decapitation plays, where your opponent will only need to remove a few specific pieces in order to make your plans no longer be viable, because you don't have multi-role troopers that can fulfill like multiple different roles. Now, it's relatively easy to build a Tunguska list that is resilient to that because we aren't overpaying for pieces anymore. We can have enough depth of the kind of pieces that we need. We can have multiple hackers, we can have multiple gunfighters, we can have multiple specialists, etc. It's not an untenable weakness, but it is something to bear in mind. You might be in a situation where you lose just 2 or 3 models, but if those were the wrong 2 or 3 models, maybe you've lost a significant component of your army. Now, again, this isn't different to vanilla nomads or other nomad factions. Nomads tend to be quite vulnerable to that kind of play, and Tunguska is no exception. but with basically the exception of if the enemy guided missiles your guided missile remote, you can usually build enough redundancy into the faction to let you weather many of the storms you might encounter over the course of play. So, with strengths, weaknesses, general identity, and history of Tunguska explained, let's jump into Infinity Army and go through some profiles. So we're going to start, as we usually do, with our kind of baseline link team options. We're going to first talk about our light infantry, Securitate link teams before moving on to our heavy link teams in the forms of Hollowmen. And so, of course, as you might expect, light infantry link teams starts with our line infantry, the Securitate. Now, in describing Securitate, we really do have a bit of a callback here to the bad old days of being an elite faction, where they're just expensive. You're just paying more points for stuff that you don't necessarily need. And in the case of Securitate, that is a 13 point, that's very expensive, base line trooper. And what those 3 or 4 extra points compared to something like an Alguacile or a Moderator gets you is Ballistic Skill 12, Whip 14, and the Veteran skill. Now, having some veterans in a list is not necessarily a bad thing, particularly in Tunguska. We might be looking toward having a relatively identifiable lieutenant, but we are nevertheless paying a lot for these guys. And Securitate in the old days, if you took like an entire link of them, those points, like those 3 or 4 points per model over 4 or 5 troops, that's a lot. That adds up to a significant chunk out of the rest of your list. These days, fortunately, we don't have to do that. Now, the way that link teams work has changed. We are not looking to move to like 5-person links as much. You can run that, right? You can run a Securitate link that's trying either to run a pure core or which is just putting in some wildcards, which we'll talk about in very short order. But because we have access to wildcards that are very high quality, but which don't count as Securitate, we really aren't incentivized to run more than 3 or 4 models in a link team. And because we aren't incentivized to run that many models in a link team, we don't need to run that many Securitate. Now, we do need 1 Securitate per link team, because the Securitate fire team needs a Securitate in it, unfortunately. But a couple of these guys in a list, that's fine. You can use some utility profiles from that long list that we've got access to. The paramedic, the vanilla combi rifle, and potentially either of the repeater profiles, probably the boarding shotgun is what I would lean towards, can all be interesting. Now, I don't think the 16-point repeater Securitate is a fantastic buy, but having repeaters that move up the field as part of link teams in particular, so if you have like a little 3-person or 4-person team that is going to move out and do some gunfighting and, have some objective play that it's going to be making, you're basically going to want to choose between a paramedic to attempt to bring back any troopers that you lose, noting that we are not talking about particularly high fizz here. It's going to be like fizz 10 on basically everything. But still, good to have a paramedic, and a paramedic has bonuses in certain missions. Or if you don't think you need the paramedic and you do have some points spare, having a repeater that just moves as part of those link teams moving is a very nice way to push your coverage forward and protect your link team, even if you are leaving other hackers kind of behind. So that is perfectly serviceable. It's also a template weapon. Boarding shotgun is a good model to have in a link team. So I'm pretty comfortable with either of those profiles. Finally, I don't hate the 13-point Securitate if you just need to make a link team. Yes, it's a bit of an overhead, right, compared to other light infantry, but if you just need to form a link team up, 13 points. Like, it's not the end of the world. We're just going to wear that as a veteran overhead, so we have a couple of regular orders if we lose our lieutenant. That's fine. Now, you can choose to run a full 5-person Securitate core. Their availability total, they go up to Ballistic Skill 15 with something like that payback profile, for example, but I don't think I recommend it. The heavy, all basically because you're paying 3 to 4 points compared to other line infantry per model, that's anything up to 20 points of premium over a 5-person link team. And they're still just single wound dudes. They're just Fusilier gunfighters that have really high willpower. Probably not what I would recommend, particularly given some of the other gunfighting options we have available in the faction. Use Securitate as link team glue, take exactly as many as you need and no more, and in that role they're totally fine. Now, part and parcel of the Securitate fire team, we have Tunguska Interventors. And these guys are just the OG hackers. These guys are the OG alpha hackers. Yes, that is a line infantry profile in every respect other than the things that you need to be a hacker. There is nothing about Tunguska Interventors that is inspiring outside of the hacking space, And that's kind of what I like in a hacker. It's nice to have, big, powerful multi-role pieces. I love the Charonted Hacker Lieutenant in Combined Army, for example. But there is something to be said for being Whip 15, BTS 9, with a good killer hacking device or hacking device plus, and like nothing else. The only optional upgrades other than hacking stuff on Tunguska Interventors is Fast Pandas, which are fantastic to have in a Tunguska list, so, like, excellent. These guys just have very high willpower, very high BTS, and very good hacking devices, which makes them, unsurprisingly, very good hackers. Now, there's something else to note about Tunguska Interventors, because invariably, right, we are going to compare them to other hackers that exist in the game, other hackers that are light infantry hackers. So you might, if you're playing vanilla nomads, you might say, well, like, I could take Jasmine Jazz, and yes, she has lower willpower, and yes, she has lower BTS, but she's also cheaper, and she's got, like, multiple hacking programs because she's got Upgrade Trinity, etc. And that's very viable, right? In vanilla nomads, I would probably lean towards Jazz over an Interventor most of the case. But in Tunguska, right, we just spent all of this time talking about how you don't want to take any more Securitate than you absolutely have to. And because Tunguska Interventors can join a Securitate fire team, part of what they are doing is helping you avoid having to overspend on line infantry. An extremely sound link team option is one Securitate, one Interventor, and one model with a gun. That is not expensive. You will be taking the Interventors already, and so they are effectively saving you a pretty significant investment, both in terms of troop slots and actual points, by just being the second in a three-person team that you're then going to put a gun and a line infantry in. They're also a fantastic specialist, and if that link team is moving up the field, the ample number of fast panda profiles that you have mean that you can do network extension while you're doing it. Now, in terms of pitches versus fast pandas, I like both. I think if I'm given the choice, a ballistic skill 12 pitcher is kind of my happy place, but I am still very comfortable with fast pandas. Fast pandas are lower risk, and lower capability as a result. You can't project your network as far, but you don't have to roll. You get to just place the damn thing. You get to place it anywhere that you would like inside zone of control. It then projects network out beyond that. Fast pandas are the ultimate in just get it done as far as network projection goes. You have to put in a little bit more work, you have to get a little bit closer, but once you've done that, you have guaranteed network projection and the ability to do things like deploy those little gremlins on rooftops where you might not be able to see with a pitcher. You face fewer restrictions once you accept the range limitation. Now, in terms of profiles here, there's a few that I like. One of them is the Lieutenant. Now, you can take a Lieutenant with or without a Fast Panda, but either way, it's going to be a Combi Rifle Hacking Device Plus profile. Yep, excellent. Now, obviously, if you take a Whip 15 Lieutenant, there is really only one of those in Tunguska. So if you want a Lieutenant decoy, it means taking a second Tunguska Interventor Hacking Device Plus. That's actually not the worst thing in the world. Like, you can take a few of these in a list. It's pretty heavy investment, but it can be well worthwhile. Alternatively, just keep your damn lieutenant safe. A model like a Tunguska Interventor Lieutenant, it is fine to have that as your reserve drop to hide from things like impersonators. It's totally fine. I also really, really like the Killer Hacker Interventor, and I usually will not leave home without one of these. There are a couple of reasons why. The first is they are one of the best killer hackers in the entire game, just period. They have, in my opinion, the best Trinity upgrade, which is Trinity -3, which you otherwise, I think, only see on Hassassin Barids in Hack Islam. But rather, as compared to Hassassin Barids, who are Whip 14 BTS 3, an Interventor is Whip 15 BTS 9. And although we might talk about hecklers a little bit later, it's that killer hacker interventor profile that has basically obsoleted hecklers for me. I see a lot, yes, I know, I see a lot on the internet where people who are complaining about nomad guided missile play will almost always talk about how it's a heckler that starts a little bit forward and then moves and then moves and places a fast panda, and it's no possible way to defend against that, and etc. Right? We've all heard that at this point. It's the end of N4. N5 is coming. I don't really want to rehash those fights at all, but for me, if I'm going to be paying 22 to 23 points, I think I'd actually rather use a Tunguska Interventor because I don't always make those kind of suicide plays, right? If you're using that kind of turn one heckler, place a fast panda, often that kind of run results in the heckler's death because the heckler can't re-enter a camouflage state. So if it gets discovered on the way forward, it's often going to be making a suicide run to place the actual fast panda, which means even though you get your network down, you've paid a troop slot and 23 points to do it. Whereas by comparison, a killer hacker interventor has to spend an order to enter a marker state, but that marker state won't detonate mines, and it can re-enter that marker state. And it doesn't deploy that far behind the heckler, and it does all of this other stuff. Like once a heckler deploys its fast panda, it's a combi rifle. It's not a bad combi rifle, but it's a combi rifle. An Interventor, once it deploys its fast panda, is still one of the best killer hackers in the entire game and a Whip 15 specialist. And it has a shotgun rather than a combi rifle, which means that attempts to move in and destroy it are more challenging, or at least cost you in the trade. Now, if all you are doing is doing turn 1 herp-a-derp guided missile plays attempting to kill 2 of your opponent's troops and thereby win the game somehow, then yes, a heckler is probably better. But over a 3-turn game where you are looking to accrue advantage and optimize your force in terms of the 15 troop slots that you have and how you are spending your points, for me, the Interventor Killer Hacker kind of just obsoletes the heckler once you learn how to use it. However, that is an expression of how I personally play, even in Tunguska. Even if I have 2 Interventor hacking device pluses and an Interventor killer hacker, I'm not that likely to be firing missiles on the first turn. I am much more likely to be using the first turn to do things like eliminate my opponent's info war, which it's really good to have a really good killer hacker to do that, for example, and otherwise set the preconditions for victory over 3 turns rather than just trying to fire missiles on the first turn, which, yes, can result in 1 or 2 very significant kills. If your opponent has an identifiable lieutenant, for example, you can buy yourself a turn, you can stall the game out. It's just, I have found locally people are quite good at defending against missiles. There are only a select number of opponents based on the armies that they play that missiles are a turn 1 play for me. All of that collectively results in Interventor killer hackers really just being better overall in terms of the broad capability that they bring than hecklers. And as you might guess, therefore, I like Interventors quite a lot. So there's a lot to recommend to Interventors, and the list that I showcase at the end of this is going to have 2 or 3 of them, and those will be the only hackers. Now, there are other hackers that you can play in Nomads, which segues us into the Casino Security Rounders. Now, these are one of the first of 3 different regiments that fall into that role of specialized model, potentially gunfighter, that you add in as the 3rd model in a Securitate fire team. And I will admit, I actually zeroed in a little bit on these guys just as a kind of gunfighting option, but we're going to look beyond that a bit in this assessment. So, what are Casino Security Rounders? For me, these are nevertheless my preferred gunfighting model to wildcard or to join into. They're not a wildcard technically, they can just be part of a Securitate link. They're my preferred model to do so. They have Ballistic Skill 12 with Marksmanship and an MSV1, which is a very good gunfighting profile. It means typically you'll be rolling something like 4 or 5 dice, hitting on 15s, which is just, even against mimetism models, which is just very good at winning face-to-face rolls. Even something like Phoenix, for example, you can kind of roll in with these guys and actually have a pretty decent chance to win the firefight. Now, in terms of other skills, they have a biometric visor, which it actually is not bad to have. Like, Assassins and Hackerslam can be a real pain for nomads generally and Tunguska in particular to deal with. And having just an option that's like, no, I have a tool. I have a tool specifically for killing Assassin for days. Stuff you. That's kind of nice. If you asked me, hey, would I cut the biometric visor from the rounder if I was trying to optimize the profile and save the 1 or 2 points that it costs? Yes, probably, but it isn't bad to have. They also have NCO. Now, NCO in Tunguska is kind of a nice to have but not essential skill because we have access to very good lieutenants in the form of Tunguska Interventors. It's very easy to spend the lieutenant order in Tunguska if you take an Interventor LT. But it's not bad to have NCO. NCO is a good skill, and the Broad Security Rounder package is still quite nice, especially as a Link team member. Now, the only profile that I think you just shouldn't use, period, here is the boarding shotgun. It does not make good use of everything that the rounder is doing. 21 points is not necessarily unreasonable, but just don't take that. What we're looking at are the Shock Marksman Rifle and the Red Fury. Take the Red Fury if you have the SWC. The points difference, just for the burst, it's worth it just taking the Red Fury. You take the Shock Marksman Rifle only if you are really hard up for SWC. And in Nomads, you can absolutely be in that situation. There are a lot of ways in Tunguska to spend your SWC. We have a 2 SWC tag, 1.5 SWC Vertigo Zond, our hackers all cost SWC. You can run short of SWC very quickly, and in that situation, the Shock Marksman Rifle can be a friend in a time of need. But if you have the points and the SWC, go for the Red Fury. Now, the other profile that's worth considering is actually the submachine gun hacker, specifically because it's a great third hacker in a list. Usually you will want at least one Interventor regular hacker. I will usually want at least one Interventor killer hacker. Not necessarily always, but that's how I like to run the list, as I've just covered rather. But you kind of, in my experience, always want a third hacker in those kind of setups, because one Spotlight in ARO, or one Oblivion, or one Carbonite is just a little prone to failure. Your odds of using your hacking network as an ARO tool get much, much better when you add even just a second hacker into the mix to make that second roll, that second Spotlight, that second Carbonite, that second Oblivion. And the Casino Security Rounder is a fantastic second hacker because it's a hacking device with Trinity as an upgrade profile. So even if one of your two Interventors dies, it's got your back no matter which of the ones that went down is. It's going to be Whip 13 BTS 3, not outstanding, but it's good enough as a hacker that you won't spend orders on, except if one of the other ones dies. I'm not going to put it in the list that I showcase at the end of this faction focus, but I do want to call it out as something that you might consider. It's a cool option, particularly if you're trying to build lists that aren't leaning as much into the hyper-specialized unit style and more into generalists. Our next unit that can join Securitate teams, I'm going to call it a wildcard by accident at least once, but it is actually just part of the Securitate team, is the Kulak payback unit. These are the second of two right after the Rounder units that got added with the reinforcement pack. Now, these guys, for my money, are a bit more of a mess as far as the profile goes. You're paying for quite a lot of things. So really there's 1.5 profiles that are worth considering here. The first is the Heavy Rocket Launcher. It's Ballistic Skill 13 with Mimetism -3 that goes to Burst 3 in a Link team, and it's 22 points. And it's got a Pulsar +1 burst, so Burst 3 in a Link, and a multi-pistol. It's just a cheap gunfighter to throw into a Link if you can't afford the, 26-point Rounder. For my money, it isn't as good as a Rounder. I don't like it as much as a Rounder, but it does have longer range, right? The Rounder is limited to 24-inch range bands. The Heavy Rocket Launcher has out to 32. And it's a template, and if it needs to, it can serve much more effectively as an ARO piece because it has that longer range and that template, etc. The only other profile that the Kulak payback unit has that we might consider are the chain of command profiles. For me, probably the Combi Rifle +1 burst. Now, Combi Rifle +1 burst, that's Ballistic Skill 13. It will be burst 5 in a Link team, only out to Combi Rifle range bands, but it does have Mimetism, it does have BS 13. Burst 5 on 13s with Mimetism is pretty good at winning face-to-face rolls and fighting, even if a Combi Rifle's damage isn't that high. Because it's got Ballistic Skill Attack Shock, it's effectively a shock weapon in any case. And it's got Chain of Command, and because of the fact that Interventors are a quite nice profile to take as your lieutenant, we can occasionally have obvious or visible lieutenant profiles in Tunguska, and it can be worth it to just pay for Chain of Command if your opponents are adapting really heavily to that. Now, 30 points is frankly eye-watering. It's very expensive because all of that stuff on the Kulak is expensive, and Chain of Command is a very expensive skill. But as an adaptation, you have a serviceable gunfighter that might combine well with a longer range weapon, who is a specialist who gives you some insurance if your opponents are getting really, really good at going after your Interventor LT. The Kulak Chain of Command is something that you might consider. I wouldn't consider any of the other Kulak profiles. I think if any of those are interesting to you, you want to be looking at other pieces instead. I don't think the Boarding Shotgun is good. I don't think any of the hackers are particularly good. Just take other things that do that in this faction instead. But the Heavy Rocket Launcher and the Chain of Command have some potential and can be worth playing. Finally, the last model that we will often see added to a Securitate fire team is the Grenzer. And in particular, again, there's one model that we're interested in here, just the one. It is the 35-point Marksmanship Multispectral Visor, multi-sniper Grenzer sniper profile. 35 points is expensive for a single wound dude, but it's a Marksmanship MSV1 BS13 sniper, which is good. Models like the Pan-Oceanian Bolt are outstanding for a reason, and the Grenzer is no different. Mostly no different. The big significant difference is that a Grenzer is almost impossible to ever have benefit from pure core bonuses. You basically can't for all practical purposes, which means that the best you're going to get the Grenzer to is Ballistic Skill 14 in a big Link team, which means that we'll be hitting on 17s, Burst 2 in ARO. That's not bad, but it's not what it used to be. I think the Grenzer still lives rent-free in a lot of people's heads as one of the game's like penultimate ARO pieces, because there was a time before the Link team change when you would staple a Grenzer into a team of like 3 Securitate and an Interventor and the Grenzer, and the thing was nightmarish. It's 2 to 3 points ballistic skill lower than it was in those days, and that's a really significant material difference. Now, I still don't mind it. I think in a 2-list pairing, there's a lot of argument for having a Grenzer sniper in a smaller Link team in one of your 2 lists if you are planning on having lists that adapt to either opposing force or table. If we consider, say we have 2 lists, they're very, very similar, but in one list we have a Rounder at the head of a 3-person team, and at the other list we have a Grenzer at the head of a 3-person team. We could use that as the basis for deciding which list to use if we look at the table and we go, oh, right, there are some long fire lanes here, and there's a couple of spots that are really good for an emplaced sniper, or that my opponent is going to be able to emplace on like a very long way away from my army. I don't want to rely on the cheaper Rounder for this kind of face-to-face role. I want to use the Grenzer instead. Or equally, if we're looking at the matchup and we go, well, there's like an okay place in each deployment zone for a Grenzer sniper, and I really want a piece that is high quality, trying to pin enemy pieces back as they might advance under smoke, and I don't want to use the Rounder for that. It's a tiny bit more fragile, but has shorter range and is less dangerous. I want the Grenzer for this. I don't use the Grenzer in pickup games a lot for that reason, right? Because it's the sort of thing I would want to really know what I was heading into, what the table was going to be like, what if I could assess the table, or if I could assess the opposing force, which is the kind of thing you're more likely to do when you have a list pairing available to you in an event. In pickup play, I just tend to write very generalist lists the day before without knowing what my opponent is going to be using, what we'll be playing on. I don't turn up to pick up games with 2 lists to pick from, is basically what I'm saying. But if we set that aside, I think the Grenzer Sniper can have some significant utility. I don't think it is what it used to be. I think it is much more limited, much more reasonable these days. I don't think it should be in every list, but it's got a good place in one of 2 of a pairing, particularly if it's the kind of piece that you like. If you find that you benefit from ARO pieces, if you find that you want that kind of longer range, you really don't want to be caught in a situation where you're having to combine white noise and smoke to advance, then just having the Grenzer as a long-range piece can't go wrong. Now, that's an awful lot of time spent talking about basically the light and medium infantry link teams. And there's kind of a reason for that, because that's how I like to play, those are the pieces I like to use, and those are the pieces I think fits my way of playing in Tunguska best, and is why I've been playing Tunguska over vanilla nomads of late. But there is another way, and it is the old wisdom. The Hollowmen Tactical Assault Team are the heavy infantry link in Tunguska. And these things are fearsome in sort of a certain respect. The baseline profile doesn't look outstanding, but it doesn't look bad either. There's some interesting optimizations, I guess you would say here, where these guys aren't paying for particularly high fizz or CC, and that means that they come in pretty reasonably costed for what are otherwise core linkable, full link bonus accessible, ballistic skill 13, arm 4, BTS 6 heavy infantry. And on top of that, they get 2 very interesting skills. The first is Super Jump. Super Jump on a 6-2 move platform is very good. That's a lot of mobility in Infinity because you get the benefit of your silhouette plus those 6 inches of movement. Very few buildings like that would be remotely accessible will be inaccessible to Hollowmen because that's basically the good jumping profile. The other thing they have is remote presence in combination with structure, and that makes Hollowmen probably the best regiment in the entire game for recovering and reconstituting with an engineer. And at this point, I should basically segue into my experience with Hollowmen, which is not playing with them, it's playing against them on many occasions, against Tunguska player Tom Bowl. Now, Tom has moved overseas these days. He's pursuing an extremely prestigious academic career, which is totally unsurprising. The man is literally, as far as I can tell, a genius. But Tom and I have played many, many times at events, usually like right before either of us gets to the finals. And those games have always been tough, and on many occasions, they've been against a Hollowman team, which Tom is basically a genius at using. From him, I have learned how to play these things, and I will relate that now to you. Now, you want to play a Hollowman Link team For my money, you want to play it as a pure core. You can run pretty serviceable little link teams with Hollowmen. You can run 3-person teams. You can do things like, at that point, you can add in Stemplazons, which can join a Hollowman team. You can add in other wild cards, but Stemplazons are a nice cheap addition to the team. It's a repeater, it's a specialist, etc. But a Hollowman Haris team is just a Haris team. It's not hugely different to any other Haris team. It's a ballistic skill 13 heavy infantry and some dudes, which is fine. What I think the unique offering of Hollowmen is as a pure core, which is not cheap, right? 5 of these guys, because they don't really have any way, apart from Perseus, who is more expensive than they are, very good, but more expensive than they are, they don't have any way to retain composition bonuses without really just taking 5 Hollowmen. And you need to play them very much as the entire focus of your army, and with the same kind of discipline you would exercise around something like a tag. And so what that means is you use that 6-2 movement to move them forward, accomplish some things, use super jump to take some firefights, and then you pull back. And basically every turn you want to conduct that attack and withdrawal pattern for 2 reasons. The first reason is the missile launcher Hollowman with core link bonuses is a nightmare to try and dislodge. It's just like a Riot Goal missile launcher. Admittedly, it doesn't have the multi-spectral visor level 1, but it does have higher armor and BTS. And so you want to pull it back every turn into whatever horrific Overwatch position you can find in your deployment zone to put it in, to pin the enemy back and force them to deal with it turn after turn after turn. But the other reason you pull it back is very much the same reason you might pull back a remote presence tag, and that's to enable force reconstitution. Because Hollowmen have remote presence and good armor and BTS and multiple wounds, it is very, very difficult to put them all the way to dead in a single go. Which means that each turn, maybe you've taken some damage as part of the push forward, and then you've pulled back. You pull back to your engineer, and your engineer, even if they're lightly wounded, can repair them. And if you set that missile launcher up to defend, then if it takes damage, if it goes down, right, you can recover it with your engineer the next turn, so it can rejoin the link team. Hollowmen are, particularly with the quality of engineers you have access to in Tunguska, just a nightmare if your opponent is able to consistently, or you using them are able to consistently just recover any wounds, any chip damage, any unconscious models, and just keep bringing them back and bringing them back and bringing them back. If that style of reconstruction is something that appeals to you, if you enjoy using engineers and doctors to recover models or recover wounds, there are few better ways to invest your engineering time than in a Hollowman core link team. Now, the cost is not insignificant, right? Even with some recent additions to Tunguska in the form of the Zellenkriegers, accommodating an entire link team of heavy infantry is going to put a drain on the rest of your list. They really do become the focus. But with that caveat, and with kind of the note that there's only so many weapon options here, you're going to be, you're probably going to have to take the hacker hacking device just to have a specialist, which does give you a tin bot. Then you're probably taking the multi-rifle for some piercing, the missile launcher, and the Spitfire, and then after that, a combi rifle chain colt, maybe, or probably the boarding shotgun for a specialist operative. It builds itself out reasonably well, but it's going to be expensive. So everything you do has to revolve around the Hollowmen, the list has to support them. But in that situation, fighting against them is one of the most uphill battles I have ever played multiple times in Infinity. They're not for me. This kind of link is not how I prefer to play Infinity, but I have seen their quality firsthand. And if you learn how to use them and you learn that discipline, right, you learn to chart the course where they push forward, they take some fights, they do some damage, they accomplish some mission objectives, they pull back, they re-establish the hard ARO presence, and then your second combat group repairs any damage that they've suffered. That is just an outstanding strength if you can make it work. Now, from the top end of the faction, we scream all the way down to the bottom end, which is warbands, which is to say Tunguska has warbands that aren't Perseus, finally. And this is the other really, really big change that I mentioned, alongside the addition of the reinforcements models. Zellenkriegers, Extreme Zellenkriegers, and Den McConnelly. It's very hard to overstate how much of a big deal adding these to the faction has been. Now, I don't necessarily think the Zellenkriegers are the best warband in the game. In fact, almost certainly as far as irregular warbands go, they are not, but they are still a solid irregular warband. They're good, right? A lot of what they do is good. I like the profiles, but they're 8 points. And you can get other warbands that are in this kind of category, like Morlocks are 6 points, and are basically as good and have some utility the Zellenkriegers don't. But as much as 2 or 3 points is significant, particularly over multiple models, it doesn't matter. Zellenkriegers add a capability to Tunguska that they otherwise would not have, which is smoke and close combat and all of the things that a warband does. And then in addition to add that, they add models that Tunguska otherwise would not have, which is just things that cost less than 13 points because I don't want to take that many Securitate. Yes, we're going to take our transductor zones, but after we've taken our transductor zones, we start looking at things like mulebots, maybe? And I never want to take mulebots as order remotes if I can avoid it, because deploying Silhouette 4 models is just challenging. I would much rather have, in that 8 to 12 point slot, things that are going to do stuff for me even if it's irregulars. And that's where Zellenkriegers fit in. They just do all of the wonderful things that warbands do. They move forward, they trade, right? They're quite good at berserking. They have template weapons. I like both of the profiles here. How I will generally configure my lists is that my regular Zellenkriegers, which have the sort of like high roll potential with metachemistry, I'll take the heavy pistol +1 burst options. And then on my extreme Zellenkriegers, which basically just don't get metachemistry but do have a whole bunch of like just stats, I'll take the light shotgun on because I know I'm not going to roll any movement attributes that might cause me to want to berserk more often. So I'll just take the better template weapon in their case. Overall, Zellenkriegers are just a good warband that I like a lot, but there's one other small but notable synergy that is worth mentioning in the context of Tunguska. I just spent a bunch of time talking about how if you wanted to invest your time in an engineer, pieces like a Hollowman were a fantastic option. And there are other things in Tunguska that you can use to leverage an engineer as well. For example, the Vostok Sputnik still exists and is quite good. A bit more reasonably costed these days than it was on release. You won't put it in every list, but it's a very serviceable attack remote. You can engineer that up. And Zellenkriegers, if you're taking an engineer, Zellenkriegers have structure. Now, most of the time, having structure is just a different way of having a wounds attribute. It's no big deal. Although, hypothetically, for example, if one of your regular opponents plays Spiral Core, then having access to warbands with structure is a very nice quality of life, addition to the sectoral. But outside of that relatively niche possibility, the fact that Zellenkriegers can, if you want to, synergize with an engineering style of play, that's just nice. It's a bit more of a niche list. It's going all in on a little bit more, but there is absolutely a list out there that does things like run a clockmaker and multiple Zondbots, and really attempts to effectively engineer pieces like the Salamander, the Vostok, and even your Zellenkriegers. I like that. I like the fact that you can build a list that is almost entirely supported by one really hardworking Whip 15 engineer, which is just a nice thing to have, and makes Zellenkriegers and Extreme Zellenkriegers just one more reason why they're a wonderful addition to Tunguska. The main reason, though, and just jumping here to the Extreme Zellenkrieger profile, really they're part and parcel, right? You'll use the Extreme Zellenkrieger and the regular Zellenkrieger pretty much in whatever, like they have availability 2 and 1 respectively. You'll use them in whatever configuration and combination you want, but really they're part and parcel of the same regiment. They're just a wonderful addition to Tunguska. Now, alongside Zellenkriegers, we also saw the release and addition to Tunguska of Den McConnelly, who I am going to call out as slightly different to the previous two and worth having his own discussion about. Den McConnelly is different from Zellenkriegers mostly because, well, firstly, he's upstatted. He doesn't have a second wound or anything like that, but you are getting some changes to the profile that are significant. Move 6-2. Martial arts, the combination of a burst 2-chain rifle and the extra burst heavy pistol, and the really nice AP DACCW. These are all additions that are pretty significant, particularly the 6-2 movement and the martial arts are significant additions to the profile, which you pay for, and of course you pay for being regular, but the fact that he's regular is a really big deal as well. And I think Den McConnelly, by stepping out of the category of irregular warbands and into the category of regular warbands, I would say he is up there with the best regular warbands in the game. There are people who have called him overpowered, and those people are wrong. He's not, but he is very good. He is about as good as things like McCall's and Dadarazi, which for my money are basically the 2 best regular warbands in the entire game. Something like a Varangian Guard is probably like a very distant third in the category. But even so, when we're talking about regular rather than irregular warbands, being next to McCall's and Dadarazi is pretty illustrious company. And why why a regular warband is such a big deal is that it's one more piece that you can take that fights and trades and does all of those things that warbands do that are good without being one more irregular piece, because we can only fit so many irregulars in a list before it becomes very unwieldy, before our ability to make our combat groups work starts to fall apart, because we can't push all of our orders through a single troop, etc. The great luxury of a regular warband is that it doesn't have to do anything if it doesn't want to. If all Den McConnelly does is maybe take one impetuous activation into a safe spot and then chill for a whole turn, or 2 whole turns, or even 3 whole turns, he was 12 points for a regular order, and he was generated that regular order the entire game. And now 12 points for a regular order is a touch expensive, but it's cheaper than a Securitate. And so what that means is that with Den McConnelly, when we put him in a list, we are paying for all of the potential of a great quality warband without the fact, the overhead of having to make something happen with them. Because with Zellenkriegers and Extreme Zellenkriegers, because they are irregular, you can only stretch those irregular forces into the rest of your list so far. Particularly in the current ITS season with O12 Prestige, which I do expect to go away in the next ITS season. I don't expect it to stick around, but we'll see. N5 is coming. With those irregular warbands, sooner or later you have to spend their irregular orders on them, which means that they are less tactically flexible because they often just don't have the option of contributing by doing nothing. Den McConnelly does, plus when he does do something, he tends to go off pretty hard. He's just a single wound trooper. He's not, for example, shock immune. Any defensive resilience he gets is just trying to high roll through metachemistry, hoping for something like maybe regeneration or no wounding cap. But that really doesn't matter so much when his 2 performance modes are either doing awesome warband things or safely and comfortably generating a regular order every turn. I am pretty sure Den McConnelly is in basically every Tunguska list that I write, not because I think he's overpowered, but because of that utility. He is a good regular model that has a wonderfully high ceiling for his performance if it becomes one of those games where he's going to do something. Great profile, genuinely should probably be in most of your lists, just because of that utility, that wonderful utility that a regular warband brings. Now, from our warbands, we go into a unit category that I have come to call rapid offensive units. Some time ago, I made a video about the 5 best types or the 5 most dangerous types of unit in Infinity and how to fight them. And I think at the time, I called this category something like main battle warbands. And that's because the category included pieces like bearpods and dog warriors and stuff like that. But I've thought about it more since then, and what I would more or less call the category these days is rapid offensive units. Units that are tough and dangerous and fast and tend to get slung toward your deployment zone at high speed. Real spearhead kind of pieces. And there are only so many of those in the game, and they tend to be fearsome when they exist. Everyone knows that bearpods are very, very scary, right? What bearpods do is that they run at you aggressively in the same way that any warband would, but they're armor 5 and have an absolute bucket of wounds. Sujans are terrifying for the same reason. They are hypermobile, they cross the board very quickly, and when they get to you, they're just very hard to stop. You are not going to stop a Sujan with a chain rifle. And puppet bots fall into that category in Nomads and Tunguska, and they are comfortably one of my favorite units in the entire game. Now, they come with a notable weakness, which is that there is a 1 wound dude at the back of your deployment zone piloting the things. You need to keep Puppet Master alive. But if you keep Puppet Master alive, Puppet Bots are, I feel like I don't need to explain this. They are 2 to 3 2-wound troops that gunfight and trade and don't eat into your trooper count and therefore are totally expendable. You lose no orders when they die. They're frustratingly resilient. They are cheap. They're just excellent. Yes, a full Puppet Bot package with Puppet Master costs as much as a heavy infantry in many cases, but they just return on that investment so well. And they are fast, and they are specialists. My usual loadout is just the cheap Puppet Master. Now, I've had to cut it off on this video because there's only so much space on the screen, but Puppet Masters have counterintelligence. You can take just a 12-point Puppet Master. It's cheaper than a Securitate, and it has counterintelligence. You should always have at minimum just a puppet master, because paying so few points for counter intel is very, very useful. Counter intel is one of those skills where once you start putting it on like a 20-something point model, it starts to be a little questionable in terms of the value. Like, I'm not going to take bloody, what's his name, Tao Wu, just for counterintelligence. Tao Wu is very expensive. One order on the first turn is maybe not worth that much. But for 12 points, for a trooper that is regular, cheaper than a Securitate, absolutely. But once you take the Puppet Master, probably take Puppet Bots as well, because they're very, very good. In terms of profiles, this is a case where the Red Fury gets taken only if you are absolutely flush with SWC. Usually for me, it's a 2-pair. It's the Forward Observer Boarding Shotgun and then the BS Attack Shock AP Marksman Rifle. 12 points and 14 points respectively for 2 wounded troops with Ballistic Skill Attack +1 burst while they're at full power. Fast, dangerous. The Forward Observer is even a Whip 14 specialist. You can close assault with the boarding shotgun, knowing full well that it is entirely expendable, and you can gunfight quite serviceably. Burst 4, Ballistic Skill 12, AP Shock it's not like a world beater, right? It's Burst 4, Ballistic Skill 12, but it's on a piece that is moving up the field alongside the boarding shotgun. And it's therefore very easy to get opportunistic angles or engagements that just call for a 24-inch range gun. Now, because these are remotes, you can give them support wear, and at that point, going from Ballistic Skill 12 Burst 4 to Ballistic Skill 12 Burst 4 Marksmanship, that actually is quite a good gunfighter. And you can even, if you want to be particularly cheeky, put Marksmanship on the boarding shotgun one. Now, you're not going to take Marksmanship shots with the boarding shotgun, but you absolutely at that point can take Marksmanship assisted shots with your Forward Observer. The Forward Observer is natively Burst 2, which means it goes to Burst 3 because it is a ballistic skill attack, and your Whip 14, which means that you're firing 3 dice on 14s with your Forward Observer rolls out to 24 inches, which is, look, it's very niche. It's very niche. I've done it exactly once, but it was a hell of a play on the one occasion that I did. It turned an otherwise shotgun-armed model into a genuinely dangerous long-range threat because there was a Vertigo Zond, and in this case a Salamander, just kind of hanging out ready to take advantage of that targeted state. Puppet bots are even great as a defensive tool because, again, you don't suffer anything other than just the loss of material when they go unconscious, because they are not the ones generating your orders. It's the Puppet Master that generates the regular order. So the fact that you can use the Puppet bots if you need to as ablative defense to do things like engage, say, enemy bear podes that are attacking you, for example, in knowledge that, look, if your Puppet bot goes down, yes, you've lost a capability, but you haven't lost any of the orders that you would use to fuel the rest of your list. I just have an absolute ton of time for these guys. Alongside Den McConnelly, right, these are auto includes in my Tunguska list. If you don't take the Puppet bots, you should still probably auto include at least the Puppet Master. And if you do that, you can consider upgrading him either to the Mine Layer or the Hacker. Only take the Hacker Puppet Master profile if you don't have any Puppet bots attached to him. He isn't per se a bad hacker with 14, BTS 3, that's very reasonable, particularly for 17 points, very reasonable for a counterintelligence model, but you do not want your puppet bots to be able to be completely disabled by some random dude with Trinity killing your puppet master by blowing their brains out. So only take the hacking puppet master if it's the only piece in the package that you're taking, but you could choose to take it in that circumstance. Great model, absolute, one of the selling points of Tunguska for me, and always have been. Now, from puppet bots, we move into our other mechanized weapons platform, which is the Salamander. Salamandra? Salamandra is one of my favorite tags. It's not flashy, like, for example, compared to something like the Dragao. It has less ballistic skill, for example, and it isn't a remote presence tag. But there's a lot to recommend about the Salamandra. The biggest downside to it is that it's SWC 2, right? 2 SWC to pay for this thing is kind of non-trivial. There are a lot of pieces that demand SWC costs in Tunguska, and although generally you can afford to take what it is that you need, particularly if you've added a guided missile package to the list and you add a Salamandra, you're starting to look for other guns that maybe don't cost you too much SWC. That's where we go back to things like the marksman rifle armed pieces that we've discussed previously, puppet bots and rounders. But for all that, having a piece like a Salamander is it's just incredibly useful. Having a big, long-range gun that you can just spool up and put shots down range, and it's burst 5, and it's dangerous, it's just very, very useful to have a piece like this in a list. And particularly now that we have access to some cheaper models to pad the list out, right? There's plenty of 7-point in the terms of forms of remote, and then 8 and 9-point warband pieces, we can build a list pretty comfortably around a salamandra now, which means that there's really, if you want a big gun, this is one of the very, very good options that you have. You can absolutely run Tunguska with more of a focus on diversified assets, spreading your troops out a little bit more, running like maybe multiple Harris-linked solid quality marksman style pieces, very, very serviceable. But you can also run like one of those link teams and have a salamander just as a massive sawed-off cannon. Now, while we're talking about the Salamandra, there are some things that make it very cool and unique. One of them is that it's got a killer hacker as the pilot. This is something that will be good for two reasons. The first reason is that hackers have some of the best specialist bonuses and ability to do classifieds kind of in the game. It's pretty rare to have a tag that can actually meaningfully do some classifieds, and the fact that the Salamandra can is quite nice because it's going to be one of your most mobile hackers. There are also a lot of missions that just have a hacking bonus, which means that the Salamandra pilot will be doing those missions on 2 dice 16s a lot of the time. The other reason why it's nice to have a killer hacker as your tag is that one of the big weaknesses of tags is that they're susceptible to info war. If you move this thing into the midfield and just some random camouflage marker turns out to be a hacker, any other tag, right, if it survives, you survive the total control attempt, for example, and at BTS 9, good chance to do so. Any other tag's only option is just to either sit there or take more arrows trying to leave that space. But the Salamandra pilot can just be like, okay, hold on 1 second. She can drop out of the tag and kill a hacker, that Al-Hawa or Shrouded hacker, for example, that's sitting on a rooftop, and just neatly eliminate it. And that's, again, it's only going to happen very occasionally, but it's very, very cool. And it actually is at the point where your opponent may choose not to reveal a hacking model to attempt to ARO your tag, in the knowledge that if they fail, they're going to get Trinity'd by the pilot, who can just pop out and take the kill. Now, the BTS 9 on the Salamandra is also very nice. Going from BTS 6 to BTS 9 makes a big deal against just a subset of weapons, basically all info war, things like viral weapons. It's an upgrade that is a luxury, but it's a very nice luxury to have, and which will pay off more often than you would think. So the Salamander is the only tag available to Tunguska, but if I had to just pick one, I would pick this one, basically. It's very, very solid. I've got a lot of time for it, and it fits very easily these days into Tunguska lists. Now, I have talked for too long. We are running out of runtime on this video, but we're going to just jump through a few independent elements, kind of cool pieces, wildcards in the non-rules sense that you might throw into a list because they're cool and fun. And we're going to start with the Zond Nordica Rapid Offensive Unit. Actually called a Rapid Offensive Unit, I don't think the Zond Nordica meets my definition of Rapid Offensive Unit. But it does come pretty close because of the disposability of the Zond mate. The Zond Nordica has a number of profiles that are interesting, but I personally I've got a lot of time for the 21-point boarding shotgun. That is 2 models with templates that can move in and do some damage and get some kills, and generally be frustrating and annoying for your opponent, while still giving you a little bit of that disposable kind of element that you get from having a model that is a peripheral with a template weapon. However, you could also very easily take any of the other profiles. The Spitfire, if you've got the SWC for it, is a Ballistic Steel 12 Mimetism Spitfire on a very fast platform, and the Hacker is a Hacker, which makes it a specialist on a very fast platform. I personally like the boarding shotgun. It's fun to just like squeeze that into lists where you can. 21 points is pretty affordable, and it's a really fun capability to play with. More expensive, but potentially very, very good, is Raoul Spectre. Raoul goes into just a whole bunch of link teams if you feel like you can afford him. The man is expensive. Every profile is north of 30 points. But he is one of the OG alpha Chad kind of profiles where you have one dude that just combines a whole bunch of stuff that's very annoying and dangerous. He's a martial arts natural born warrior melee fighter. He's got no incapacitation. He's got mimetism -6, a variety of gunfighting options, and he's got a combat jump profile as well, which he's one of those pieces where paying 33 points for a combat jump model is like, all right, 2 in 3 chance to just absolutely crack the game open, because that profile, if it lands, it's not hackable, it's intensely dangerous, it's got a template weapon and no incapacitation to make use of the template weapon, and drop is, it just breaks the game apart if he lands, and if he doesn't, it's 33 points in your deployment zone, which is a little bit difficult to wear. But if you're willing to put him into a list, if you like that kind of high risk, high reward, right, chip in a chair style play, and you think you can afford him, Very solid, very fun, very powerful in absolute terms, but kind of fair relative to the points cost style of play. In a very similar vein, we have Perseus, who similar kind of points cost. Perseus can join, I feel like in one of his two forms, FTO or FTO2, can join basically any link team that you might try to construct in Tunguska. And in doing so, he's a Mimetism 6, Burst 4, Breaker Combi Rifle +1 damage with no wound incapacitation, and smoke grenades, and great close combat. The only problem, of course, is that he's north of 30 points. But if you wanted to put him in, right, like you've taken your single compulsory Securitate, and you've taken maybe an Interventor, and you have no SWC left, and you decide that actually rather than a rounder, what you want is a BS13 Mimetism 6 smoke grenade breaker combo rifle +1 damage as the tip of your spear. There's definitely nothing wrong with that as an option, other than that, yep, the dude is expensive. But as far as linked teams go, linked smoke, great melee, a little bit of durability, very, very solid, just expensive. This is the kind of piece when I talked about how Tunguska used to be elite in the sense that they were expensive. Perseus, is a little bit like that, but you really do get what you pay for him. It's just that you can only afford to pay for so many pieces like that. Much like Raoul Spectre, you need to make space for a piece like Perseus to fit into your list, which is not easy, but he can pay off big time if you do. Now, finally, there are a bunch of pieces that I haven't mentioned. I feel like I should have. I should have mentioned Mary Problems. Here's my mention of Mary Problems. She isn't an Interventor and can't link. I'm not taking Mary Problems because the ability to link is so valuable, because we don't want to take too many models in a link team after paying for our Securitate, etc. Covered all of that. Mary Problems is fine on her own merits. I'm just going to take Interventors instead. All right, I've mentioned Hecklers. Haven't mentioned Fiddler. She's in this faction. Do you want even more synchronized models? Fiddler is for you. Freaking awesome. I think you can run an ungodly number of synchronized profiles in Tunguska if you really want to. We're going to end on the Kriza Special Crisis Unit, and we're ending on the Kriza Special Crisis Unit mostly as a way of looking toward N5. And by looking toward N5, I mean looking back to N3, remembering what was, and kind of hoping it might come again. As they are, Kriza are not a piece I think I would recommend to too many lists. Yes, they are Burst 5, Mimetism, BS13 pieces, but they are ultimately fairly expensive for that. And a heavy machine gun, there are some targets that you just can't super efficiently dislodge. I don't want to use a Kriza to try and engage something like an enemy tag, for example. But there was a time when Kriza rather than Mimetism, had what today we would call Ballistic Skill Attack -3. Had a different name then, doesn't matter. There is a big difference between Mimetism and BS Attack -3, because BS Attack -3 always applies. Multispectral visors don't protect you against it, dodging doesn't protect you against it. It means that the Kriza used to have just this always kind of good face-to-face roll option, which even did things like open it up as a viable lieutenant option. I don't think it's that these days, but N5 is coming, and on not the top of my list of my minor wish list of changes in profiles for N5, but something I would be quite happy to see is Kriza once again exchanging Mimetism -3 for Ballistic Skill Attack -3. Do I think it will happen? I have no idea. They could have made that change at any time in the last few years, and they chose not to, despite the fact that it was, very possible from a rules perspective. But maybe that was just something that was waiting for the additions to come around again. I'd be very happy to see that. I'm sure there are some people who would be very much not happy to see that, but I think it would see a return of Kriza as a fantastic middleweight firepower piece, where they don't have the armor piercing of a piece like, and the resilience of a piece like a salamandra, but they do have a lot of those like good odds to win face-to-face rolls that we're otherwise leaning on pieces like rounders for. So watch this space. The Kriza is my pick for things that might get good again in N5, but we'll have to wait until October to see. Now, rounding out the episode, coming in at just over an hour, we have a sample list for Tunguska Jurisdictional Command, and this is a list that I have been working on and slowly refining over about the last month in the chance that I've had to play games. This list combines basically all of the things that I personally really, really like about Tunguska, although I will admit I would love to just fit a few of those kind of, wildcard independent operator pieces in. I just can't. This is as solid as I could make a Tunguska list. So in Combat Group 1, we've got 8 regular and 2 irregular orders. We have that Puppet Master loadout where we have Puppet Master, 1 Forward Observer, 1 AP Marksman Puppet Bot. We then have a 4-person link, although you can very comfortably leave one of the interventors back in the deployment zone if you like. A 4-person Securitate link of a Rounder Red Fury, a Securitate Paramedic, Interventor KHD Fast Panda, and Interventor HD Plus Fast Panda. This gives us 2 interventors, which means that we have a Lieutenant and a Lieutenant Decoy, because you'll see one in Combat Group 2. We then have Vertigo Zond and 2 Zellenkriegers with Heavy Pistols +1 burst, and 2 Transductor Zonds. In Combat Group 2, we have a Salamandra, the Lieutenant Interventor. Now, I'm back and forth on this. There's a good argument for having both interventors with Hacking Device Plus in the same combat group, just so that your opponent can't try and make a guess as to which one is real based on how you've allocated them group-wise. I am a bit concerned that this setup flags the Combat Group 2 as the Lieutenant, so you could account for that literally by just changing them into this amended configuration that I've done in real time, where we put both of the Hacking Device Plus Combi Rifle Fast Panda interventors in one combat group, and the Killer Hacker Interventor combat in the second combat group, where it will run independent and it will attempt to, say, mark a state and move up the field. Both of those are viable configurations, really depending on what you're looking to do. Having the Lieutenant Interventor in Combat Group 2, firstly, it gives you a bit more out to spend the LT order across the 2 combat groups, depending on what you might need, and it lets you, in the second combat group, make, say, Spotlight or Oblivion or Carbonite rolls after you've gone and pushed your network forward with the first combat group by moving the link team forward. Otherwise, in Combat Group 2, apart from the Salamandra and the Interventor, we have our Extreme Zellenkrieger with Light Shotgun, Den McConnelly, and a Salute. Now, this is our fat robot. I mentioned before, I don't love paying 8 points for a regular order, but I'm willing to do it in this case, firstly because I have basically no other choice. Like, there's nothing else for 8 points or 7 points in the entire army that I can fit into this list. I would have to turn that Securitate into just a regular Securitate for 13 points to open up points for that Salute to be anything, which I don't really want to do. I'm also running I'm running 3 irregulars in this list, and that's kind of plenty for me. But the other reason I'm willing to tolerate the Salute is that I have 3 models with Fast Pandas in this list, and Fast Pandas are disposable 1. Being able to potentially reload those Fast Pandas, I feel like could pay dividends in some cases. I spoke at length about how I think interventors with Fast Pandas kind of obsolete hecklers if you're willing to really be efficient with your combat groups and how you use them, and I definitely stand by that. But if I'm running this many models with Fast Pandas for my network projection, I may as well have the ability to reload them from time to time. This list has performed very well with me. It's gone through a few incarnations. One of the first incarnations, I actually managed to fit in 2 gunfighting Harris teams. That meant 2 rounders, one with Marksman Rifle, one with Red Fury. What I found ultimately was that, firstly, wasn't really necessary, and secondly, was just stretching the list a little bit too far. I never really wanted to use the Marksman Rifle rounder when the Red Fury existed, so it kind of just sat around a lot. It was really just redundancy, and with the other things that are present in this list, and all of the smoke, and all of the white noise, and all of the close assault, and all of the gunfighting, I felt like that redundancy wasn't super needed. So this is my current go-to all-comers Tunguska list. I like it a lot. It's performed very well for me. It's very strong in the hacking game. It's very strong at close assault. It's just got a ton of teeth, as well as great ability to do missions, because it's full of specialists. Not only that, some of the specialists are fast. The only thing this list basically struggles with, and what I wouldn't want to throw it into, is something like highly classified, where there are some classifiers this list just cannot do. Like, do you roll up anything with medium or heavy infantry in it? You're kind of stuffed. There are also perishingly few veteran elite chain of command troops in this list. Right? It's literally just the Rounder and Den McConnelly, and that's it. So I wouldn't want to run this into countermeasures or highly classified, but otherwise I would be comfortable playing this, or like, and obviously something like Frostbite, for example, where you kind of build a little bit toward Frostbite. Frankly, I might even play this in Frostbite. I've done worse. But otherwise, as far as this list goes, I feel comfortable with it into basically any generic scenario, and I'm quite comfortable recommending it as a very strong Tunguska list. So that wraps up our faction focus N4 Tunguska. As always, I hope you've enjoyed this. If you'd like to support the channel, you can do so via the Buy Me a Coffee link or by becoming a channel member on YouTube. I take requests for video topics, battle report armies, and things like that from channel members, although in this case I did Tunguska as a faction focus because I wanted to do Tunguska. I have a few outstanding faction focus videos, but there's a good chance that they will wait until N5 because I feel like doing them now would be a little disingenuous. People People have asked for them, but they'd be completely obsolete in 2 months. So I'm going to be focusing a little bit more on ones I just wanted to talk about. We'll do a few, maybe between now and the new edition, before jumping into, as best we can, faction focuses for the new edition. Obviously, when I do those, I'll be working on the same amount of experience as everyone else, which is to say, not very much, but we'll do our best trying to cover what the new factions are like, what factions in the game as they change in N5, how they function. I'm very excited potentially for the Onyx rework, if it's a Bakunin style rework. And I'm already thinking about potentially doing a little bit of repainting of my now quite dated Batroids, just to maybe bring them into the scheme in advance of N5. As always, though, look, I hope very much that you've enjoyed this, and I will see you next time.